Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tejal Shah from Macquarie University's Department of Biomedical Sciences. On behalf of the ADNeT's Early to Mid-Career Researcher Accelerator Group, I'd like to formally welcome everyone to this webinar on opportunities for collaborating with ADNeT, which stands for the Australian Dementia Network. On behalf of this gathering, I'd like to take this opportunity to acknowledge the First Nations peoples of Australia and elders, past, present, and emerging. So the purpose of this webinar is to promote and explore opportunities for collaboration with ADNeT Registry, ADNeT's screening and trials, and memory clinics initiatives. We are very fortunate to hear from three of the eminent dementia researchers who are the lead in their respective areas in ADNeT. While we allow some time for our webinar attendees to join us, I'll go through some housekeeping notes. So again, share my screen. Oops, sorry. So the session will be recorded. We will have three 10-minute presentations from our key speakers. This will be followed by a 40-minute Q&A on how other researchers might get involved and collaborate. We also have the Q&A function for typing questions. If you have questions for our presenters throughout the presentation, please type into the Q&A function. Please address them to a particular speaker or a general question to the panel. Feel free to introduce yourself when you type your question, and then we will refer all the Q&A for questions and direct them to the speaker or panel after the presentations. So with this, I would like to invite Dr. Nadika Dissanayake to provide an overview of ADNeT's Accelerator Group. I also welcome Professor Chris Rowe, and thank you for joining this webinar.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nadika Dissanayake, and I'm an NHMRC Boosting Dementia Research Leadership Fellow, and also the co-chair of the ADNeT Accelerator Working Group for Early and Mid-Career Researchers alongside Professor Lee Fellow. Currently, we have Michelle Lupton, Associate Professor Michelle Lupton from QIMR, Dr. Tejal Shah, who's our host today, and Dr. Edwin and Associate Professor Tuan Nagwin within our Accelerator Group. Our Accelerator Group was initiated to support early to mid-career researchers within the field of dementia, in particular in their career development. We run a number of sessions in terms of during the Australian Dementia Forum. We ran a workshop and a networking event, which was highly successful. Alongside at past, we were the Accelerator Working Group within the National Institute for Dementia Research, or NNIDR. During that time, we ran a couple of sponsorship programs for ECR and MCRs. They were well received. We've also run surveys at past to understand the productivity and needs of the Boosting Dementia Research Fellows, as well as ARC and NHMRC Dementia Research Development Fellows. And webinars is another integral part of our activities, and this is our first webinar for the year. And I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us, and thanks for all the speakers today as well. Thank you. Over to you, Tej.
Thank you, Nadika. So we'll get on with our speakers and the presentations today. So our first speaker today is Dr. Stephanie Ward. Dr. Ward is a geriatrician and initiative lead for the ADNeT Clinical Quality Registry. The registry is a central component of ADNeT centered on benchmarking clinical practice highlighting variations in outcomes and driving improvements. Dr. Ward was the expert geriatrician on the award-winning ABC series, Old People's Home for 4-year-olds. So I would like Stephanie to share your screen and proceed with your talk. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shah, and to Dr. Disseminate for the invitation and opportunity to speak. Can you hear me? Yeah, great.
Yes.
So, and just let me know if the slides aren't progressing. So I'm going to talk about the Australian Dementia Network Clinical Quality Registry. And I'd like to acknowledge the NHMRC for funding, the ADNeT Registry Steering Committee, the ADNeT investigators led by Professor Chris Rowe and Susanna Ahern, academic lead of the registry, the amazing ADNeT Registry project team, people living with dementia and caregivers who've had input into aspects of this registry in Dementia Australia, and clinicians from participating sites so far who've been really helpful and willing to be part of this and give really honest feedback to make this as good as it can be. So what's a clinical quality registry? When we talk about registries for dementia, I think a lot of us have different ideas about what that is. And registries may exist primarily to research risk factors or progression of a disease. They may be set up primarily for that purpose. Registers may be set up to surveil the incidence and prevalence of a particular condition, such as a lot of cancer registries. And some registers set up to identify a database of people who want to be part of research studies. A clinical quality registry is a particular type of database. It's a particular type of register that has a number of features. It centres on the systematic collection of data from people with a defined clinical condition. It primarily collects data around the appropriateness and effectiveness of care. This data is used to benchmark practice and highlight variations in clinical care. And this data is used ideally to drive improvements in the clinical care that's delivered. Registries are set up in accordance with the framework for clinical quality registries, which is set up from the Australian Commission on Safety and Quality in Healthcare. And so we're thinking about people living with dementia or at risk of dementia, what types of things would we really want to measure if we're going to measure quality of care? And it might be things related to the processes of care, like what we actually do, such as what do we do at the time of diagnosis? How do we manage people? Do we make appropriate referrals on? Do we give information? What's people's interactions and availability for health services? Are we giving appropriate medications or not? Are there appropriate avenues for end-of-life care? But if we're also thinking about what are the relevant outcomes for people living with dementia or mild cognitive impairment, and it's around things like cognition, daily function, of neuropsychiatric symptoms, comorbidities like falls, unintended hospitalizations, entry into residential care, quality of life, carer well-being, social well-being. So there's a lot of things you could measure, and often we're constrained by how we can actually achieve this in practice. Registries sit within this quality improvement cycle. So when you have data about the quality you're giving, as a clinician or a healthcare provider, you can use that data to work out where you need to do better and then re-audit. Registries have other nice features as well, because there's a collection of data, not only do registries facilitate quality improvement, but they can, for example, if you know people who have a clinical condition, it can be easier to link those people up to clinical trials. A large collection of de-identified data can be utilised for other research studies. And I noticed that Edwin Tan, you've done some work with the Swedish Dementia Registry. It's also a good source of epidemiological data. And if and when new medications are ever released onto the market, it's a way of monitoring uptake and post-market surveillance. So why should there be a registry in dementia? For a few reasons. It was identified as a priority area for a registry in 2016 because it's a very prevalent condition and there's consequences of poor quality care. It fits into the national strategy for clinical quality registries, because clinical quality registries, by improving clinical outcomes, are ultimately cost effective. And it's really well recognised that there are a lot of gaps in data around dementia prevalence, incidence, and diagnosis in Australia, very recently highlighted in the AIHW's dementia data publication. And for a clinician that's participating, it's because it helps you to plan your service, audit your practices. It's a benchmarking is the gold standard in terms of auditing what you're doing, can help facilitate your own local research project. For solo practitioners, being part of a registry is a great way of being in touch with practice review, your continuing professional development, meeting that criteria. And it can sometimes also help you to prompt to do things as well. Some of our clinicians have said, well, I like it because it reminds me I need to ask about this and this. And it can be a way of linking people who otherwise wouldn't get an opportunity to be part of research studies. And that needs to be balanced against the fact that there is time that needs to be allowed for data entry, integrating into workflows, local IT processes. You're going to hear from about the other two pillars of ADNeT, the Memory Clinics Initiative and the Screens and Trials Initiative. And I put this diagram together a few years ago to help me visualise how they all fit together. And I think they all fit together really nicely, because certainly the registry is working in the first instance on a method to funnel people through to the Screens and Trials Initiative if that's of interest. And it's a great way of measuring any impact of new guidelines that come into play from the Memory Clinics Initiative, because it really will highlight people sticking to processes and what are the outcomes. And registries work by people in a diagnostic setting entering a short amount of data into a secure database, and that data is held in a safe way by a data custodian. That data is cleaned, risk adjusted, and then there's longer term data that's collected. So that may be directly from the patient and or the person living with dementia and their caregiver through their own reported measures, as well as linkage with administrative data sets. And where feasible, clinical follow-up data is important too. For example, an annual clinical data set, which is feasible in clinics that follow people up. And this data is used in annual reports, can be accessed at any point by clinicians that are inputting their data into the registry. And that's why clinicians like it, because you can download it and you can say, oh, my wait time is quite high, or, you know, I see a lot of patients with this type of dementia in my clinic. And the data custodian can help look after this data that can be used by others for research and to link into other research studies when we've got those processes up. So what we do at the moment is we recruit clinical sites, memory clinics, but we've also recruited some private specialists. We're looking to expand to other relevant outpatient settings, and ideally we'd like to engage with general practice and acute care. We're building this up. We look at obtaining local governance. Participant data is entered at the time that a diagnosis of MCI or dementia is made, and this data is entered and it doesn't take too long. I found out I can do this in a couple of minutes, but I'm pretty fast. And then the registry sends out documents to the person and or a person responsible if the person lacks capacity, with information about how to opt out of the registry. And then if they're not opting out, then people get the opportunity to complete some patient and carer reported measures. We've been working on a clinical follow-up data set to look at some of those really important outcomes, such as cognitive function, neuropsychiatric symptom burden and quality of life, and working with the Registry of Older South Australians on algorithms for longer term outcomes from administrative data sets, including things like unintended hospitalizations, hospital presentations with full delirium, and antipsychotic medication use, anti-dementia use. So at the moment, we've had over about 450 potential participants identified, 338 are on the registry, and about another 70 are in a holding database, and about 12 or 13% do elect to opt out. There are 23 sites across Australia currently contributing data, and governance authorised or in progress at about 38 sites. So we've had an uptick over time, as you would expect. Periods of lockdown do have an impact because a lot of clinics reduce the frequency of patients that they're seeing. This is just some of the examples of the characteristics of the people in our group with a high predominance of Alzheimer's disease. So I know we've only got a short amount of time, so I'm going to wrap up my presentation for the moment, stick to the schedule, and look forward to answering any questions at the end.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. As per my earlier, when we opened the webinar, please feel free to type your Q&A questions into the function for Stephanie to be answered later on in our discussion session. So I would now like to invite Professor Chris Rowe, who is the director of ADNeT and is ADNeT's Screenings and Trials lead. So Professor Rowe is a nuclear medicine physician and neurologist with over 20 years of experience in dementia research and patient care. He's the director
20.
of...
Sorry, at least 20. I'm making a comment about my age.
He's the director of molecular imaging research at Austin Health, Melbourne, professorial fellow, University of Melbourne, and NHMRC practitioner fellow, and is the inaugural director of ADNeT. Over to you, Chris.
Okay, I will screen share, and I'm sorry to the people I've shocked because I'm not wearing a tie today, but it really is me. But very rarely have people seen me without a tie before. Okay, can you all see that? Looking for a nodding head. All right, so I'm just going to speak for 10 minutes about the opportunities for collaborating with the Screening and Trials Initiative and the data we've collected. So as everybody knows, ADNeT is a collection of multiple universities, research institutes, and researchers from around Australia who work in the field of dementia. The aims of ADNeT, you've heard about the Clinical Quality Registry. Basically, it's all about speeding development. It's about improving patient care. And one of those aspects is to speed the development of effective therapies to prevent and treat dementia. And we're going to do this through increasing the number of people who are ready for clinical trials, boosting the recruitment into clinical trials, and while also boosting quality and capability of memory clinics and clinical trial sites, and improving access to the latest diagnostics as part of this process. So I'll just talk about a few of the things that ADNeT Screening and Trials has done. One of our successes to date is the ADNeT Research Volunteer Portal. You get to this by going to the Australian Dementia Network website, all one word, australiandementianetwork.org.au. And if you click on consumer, I think it's the consumer part, you'll be, up will come a button saying, do you want to volunteer for research? If you click on that, you go through, there's a consent form that you have to read and acknowledge, and then you get asked these following questions. I'm just rearranging things a little here so I can see my questions. And these are the 14 questions we ask, plus some questions about what sort of trials the person would be interested in. So this is the sort of cohort we're collecting. We ask if they're concerned about their memory. Are others concerned about your memory? Is your memory worse than it was 3 years ago? So this way we get some information on subjective memory complaint. Has your doctor told you have mild cognitive impairment? Has the doctor told you have dementia? There's a drop down, and says, if you said yes, it drops down and asks a bit more about what sort of dementia you've been diagnosed with. If you've had a mini mental state or a MOCA, Montreal Cognitive Assessment, again, it's a drop down that asks you if you know your score and what it is. You'll then ask, next question was whether your parents or brothers and sisters were diagnosed with dementia. So it's a first degree family history. Then general sort of clinical trial stuff. Are you comfortable reading and speaking English? Did you finish primary school? Are you in good physical health? Do you consent to providing a saliva sample to carry out genetic testing? So we are sending some saliva samples out, which are then forwarded up to QMIR in Brisbane, where ApoE4 testing is done, but the saliva is also being kept for further genetic and other testing. But most importantly, next question, do you consent to us contacting you about research trials? Well, if the answer is no, then why are they in this portal? But anyway, then usual sort of, again, exclusion criteria from clinical trials: cancer, schizophrenia, depression, alcohol, drug abuse, etc. Exclusion criteria for MRI, yes or no. Then finally, please indicate what sort of trial you're interested in: clinical drug trial, lifestyle intervention, observational study online, observational study direct contact, which means attending a centre for face-to-face testing, blood tests and brain scans. So, sorry, I seem to have frozen. Oh, there we go. So we have over 2,000 people signed up, and they signed up over a 2-month period. But unfortunately, most of these are Melbourne-based because our publicity was Melbourne-based. So I spoke on ABC Breakfast Radio, 3AW Breakfast Radio. We had an article in the Herald Sun newspaper. We talked about the research volunteer, but we also did mention that we're particularly interested in looking for people for preclinical Alzheimer's disease trials. And we had 800 people sign up that day. And then over the next few weeks, that number built and is now currently sitting at over 2,000. All of these people are over 50. Most are over 65. Most have a first-degree family history or subjective memory complaints or both. And very few have signed up that have a diagnosis of MCI or dementia. 70% of those that we've approached so far for a preclinical Alzheimer's drug trial have passed their initial phone screening and are going on for in-person screening and PET scans. So it's a pretty good cohort. Now, Michael Breakspear has recently done some publicity in Newcastle, so hopefully we're going to see those numbers tick up in New South Wales, or at least in Newcastle. We are still waiting on the local head investigators in the other states to get some local publicity going to further drive these numbers. But certainly if you're in the Melbourne region, we have got a heap of normal volunteers looking for research, which may be of use to you. Oh, okay, this is being annoying again. Got it. We also have been running the screening program since the start of ADNeT, and we now have over 500 patients with MCI or mild Alzheimer's disease that we've studied. So they've all got a mini mental state score of greater than 20. We're currently, have just kicked off a preclinical screening study, and that will provide 400 cognitively unimpaired persons over the age of 55, and about 100 of these will have a positive amyloid scan. We should accumulate this data over the next 12 to 18 months. So 12 to 18 months from now, we should have close to 1,000 extensively worked up persons in our database. Now, many of those will go straight into clinical trials and not be available for further research, but all their data is available for researchers. So they're undergoing extensive cognitive screening. They're also undergoing some questionnaires about lifestyle aspects and quality of life. They're all having an MRI. The basic MRI package is a 3D T1 high-resolution image on a 3T MR, a FLAIR, and a susceptibility weighted imaging. But we've also got a cohort that are getting diffusion weighted imaging and other more advanced MR techniques. All of these subjects will have amyloid PET, or have had amyloid PET. Most will have tau PET. Certainly all those who are amyloid positive will have tau PET. We've got the ApoE genotype on these people, and very importantly, we've got blood stored in liquid nitrogen for further genetic and biomarker research. And some of these patients are also volunteering for lumbar puncture, so we do have some CSF samples. Now we have set up, we've been improving access to PET traces for amyloid and tau by working with some of the academic cyclotron sites around Australia. So Royal Brisbane Hospital, Liverpool Hospital, obviously Austin Health, SAMRI in Adelaide, and the Sir Charles Gardner cyclotron site in Perth. 3 of these, or 4 of these sites are now producing all these traces, and we're expecting that all sites will be producing both these traces, and they'll be available for research within the next 6 months. And the traces they're making are NAV4694 for amyloid and MK6240 for tau PET imaging. So these traces are going to be used in clinical trials, both commercial clinical trials, but also for research. If you want to get amyloid or PET scans done in your locality, you will need to talk to the production sites, work out a supply agreement, and there will be a charge. You'll also need to talk to a PET camera site, and there will be a charge for that. The usual charge for half an hour of PET time is about $500, and the usual charge for a dose of radiopharmaceutical for academic purposes is between $500 and $700. There's also a private cyclotron group called Cyclotech, and the black dots show where they've got cyclotrons, and they produce other amyloid and tau traces, some of which are also available and can be purchased for research. So you'll get, you can access data through ADNeT now in all these people I've been talking about. There's MRI, as I've mentioned. There's amyloid plaque imaging, and there's neurofibrillary tangle or tau imaging. The tau tracer is specific for the 3-repeat, 4-repeat form of tau found in Alzheimer's disease. So unfortunately, these scans aren't much use for other tauopathies, so not good for frontotemporal dementia. They're quite specific for the type of tau you get in Alzheimer's disease. These are the sort of scans you look at. This is a patient with Alzheimer's disease, a strongly positive amyloid scan and a strongly positive tau scan on the right. Something else we're starting to move into are blood diagnostics. As I've mentioned, we've got lots of blood now stored in liquid nitrogen. One of the big advantages of ADNeT is it has extensive collaborations with other cohorts such as ABLE and PISA. So through these collaborations, we can actually reach into longitudinal existing stores of blood in highly characterized patients. And this is some of the data that's coming out from the work we've been doing with ABLE. This is looking at a particular blood phospho-tau marker. This is P217+. And you can see that it's in cognitively unimpaired amyloid negatives, that's the CUA minus. We've got a result of 71 femtograms per mil. In amyloid positive cognitively unimpaired, the level is double. And in amyloid positive AD, it's up to 260. And as you can see, those that had a clinical diagnosis of AD but were amyloid negative, and those that had MCI but were amyloid negative have the same level of this p-tau measure as normal controls. So this is an illustration of how promising these blood biomarkers are, and it's certainly something that ADNeT is pursuing vigorously. One of the other advantages of ADNeT is that it helped me and other researchers, many of whom are part of ADNeT, to put together a successful MRFF bid. So we got a $4 million grant for getting plasma biomarkers into clinical practice over the next 5 years or as soon as possible. So affiliations with ADNeT can also enhance your chances of getting some of these big grants, particularly MRFF, where they expect widespread collaboration and high community impact. So to get hold of ADNeT data, you have to go to the website again. There it is, australiandementianetwork.org.au. And you'll find an expression of interest form. It's about 3 or 4 pages long. It's not that hard to fill out, but it asks for details about who you are, what you want, and why you want it, and what's the value of your proposal. That expression of interest then goes to the ADNeT Management Board for consideration and approval. And if you get the tick, then you can access the data I've been talking about. And I think that's about the end of my talk, so I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for that wonderful talk. I'm sure we have got lots of food for our thoughts, and I request all our audience to please put in your questions into the Q&A function. So we'll now hear from Professor Sharon Naismith from the University of Sydney, and who is the lead for the memory clinics in ADNeT. Professor Naismith is a clinical neuropsychologist and HMRC Dementia Leadership Fellow and heads the Healthy Brain Aging Program at the Brain and Mind Center. Her work focuses on modifiable risk factors for dementia and clinical interventions for early cognitive decline, including cognitive training, sleep, and pharmacological interventions. She leads an NHMRC Center of Research Excellence to optimize sleep in brain aging and neurodegeneration, popularly known as CogSleep. Over to you, Sharon.
Many thanks, Tejal. And thanks for having us here today. We're very excited to share our developments in ADNeT with you. Just quickly, to go over the aims of the ADNeT Memory Clinics Network. First and foremost, we aim to develop a collaborative network. So this, of course, takes time to get to know clinicians, to get to know memory clinics, to provide support, and to really grow a cohesive network across Australia. So that's a key goal of ours and takes a lot of time and effort, but is very rewarding, in many ways, the most rewarding part. The other thing that we aim to do is to create guidelines, and I'll go through that in some more detail, to provide training to clinicians, to provide clinicians in memory clinics with new tools, and also to provide access to treatment, particularly through working with the Screening and Trials Initiative. So just on the collaborative network, it's taken some time, but we're very pleased that we've now managed to map 108 services across Australia. Many of these are public services, but also we have a range of private services. So if you go onto the ADNeT website, you can actually click or put in a postcode and find details of memory clinics that might be in your area and what kinds of things they offer. So this is a work in progress. We're continually building upon it. We're continually mapping more clinics and also getting more details and feedback from the individual clinics about the type of information they would like to have displayed. In terms of the general kind of guidelines, one thing that we set out to do first is really to try to get a feel for what is currently happening in Australia across the memory clinic network. So for those of you that may not know, we typically define a memory clinic as being multidisciplinary. So in many ways, solo private services don't necessarily fit that kind of typical memory clinic, but that's not to say that it's not within the scope of what we're interested in terms of supporting and building the network. In terms of the people that might fit, or the clinics that might fit the criteria, this initial survey essentially scoped many of these around Australia, where we were trying to get an indication of waiting times, the frequency of clinic, how they're funded, and what kind of cognitive assessment tools and other assessment tools they're using, so that we can seek to harmonise services across Australia. So this is really to standardise access so that our patients know that it doesn't matter what memory clinic they go to, they should get, at least roughly the same kind of assessment and service. So just initially, we scoped the various neuropsychology testing tools, and we hope over time to be able to at least establish that most clinics are able to do this battery of tests with their patients. But of course, clinical acumen is the most important thing. So leaving it to the clinician's judgment, but by and large, to be able to get a fairly standardized battery of cognitive tests. The other thing we've been trying to do really is scope post-diagnostic support. So Lee Fay-Low, of course, is chair of your group. She's been a big advocate of this, but also we've done a lot of work, and many people, you know, within this network have done a lot of work looking at various forms of cognitive and other interventions. And I guess we were, you know, a little bit shocked to find that only 30% of memory clinics provide any form of intervention post-diagnosis. And of those, many offer only one session. So half of those offer only one session. Another third offer 2 to 4 sessions, and 15% offer 5 to 10 sessions. So this was just an initial kind of feel for what's actually happening within the memory clinic setting currently. The other thing that's, I guess, came to our attention is that internationally there are very clear guidelines for how memory clinics should operate. Most memory clinics do promote the value of research, and I think within dementia we really have to work hard to actually promote research to our patients and to our fellow clinicians. But certainly in these UK guidelines that were developed by the Royal College of Psychiatrists, they have clear standards for assessment, for waiting times, for post-diagnostic care, for access to trials and other forms of research. They've also stipulated what an ideal wait time should be from a referral, being less than 6 weeks, but this really shouldn't be at the expense of offering good post-diagnostic care. And over time, they've actually been able to track services within the UK network and have actually shown that the capacity of staff has actually increased. So they've increased their staffing numbers, and their waiting times have actually decreased over time. And that's actually probably due to some other initiatives where they've engaged GPs and improved pathways and various things as well. So we've sought to develop for the first time national guidelines in Australia. So this is a process that's been done in consultation firstly with health professionals, and a concurrent process that's been done with consumers. So we've done an initial survey with health professionals, had consensus meetings, which many of you may have been part of, and then offered feedback. And we've done a similar process with the consumers. And then we now have a set of draft guidelines. And just yesterday and also last week, we had the final consolidation meeting for those guidelines. And that's so that we can actually propose this standardized set of guidelines for any memory clinic that's operating in Australia. Now, many clinics, of course, revert back to what is feasible, but I guess in these guidelines, we're really trying to promote the idea of best practice. What is it that a person with dementia or MCI should expect? What is best practice for us in Australia, but also in comparison to international standards? So we did do an initial survey, and I won't have time to go into all the detail of this, but we did an initial survey seeking people's opinions on current and best practice. We've mapped a little bit further some of the waiting times in public clinics versus private clinics and how these compare to international standards. And we've essentially kind of managed to work out that about 32% of clinics can see urgent clients, about 60% can see urgent clients within about 4 weeks. And non-urgent clients, about 30% can see within 3 months. So I guess this is an ongoing debate as to what is the best waiting time period for patients. But of course, this was one of the biggest issues that consumers had in the various surveys that have been done in terms of how long it takes to get a diagnosis. What we've seen here are private clinics are able to see clients more quickly. But I guess the key thing there is that the actual process of getting a diagnosis may take longer, because often when they go through a private clinic, they may then be sent on for various other investigations. Whereas in a memory clinic, it tends to be a bit more of a one-stop shop. So we've got a bit more digging to do to try to work out how to improve those wait times. We also delved a bit further into the types of interventions that were being conducted. Again, I can share these slides for all the details, but if people are interested in knowing what kinds of interventions are being conducted, it's actually a good idea to think about these, because then we can actually think about implementation gaps and what kinds of things can we work with to get grants, for example, from the health department, where we can try and implement some of the evidence-based interventions and screening packages in memory clinic settings. A little bit more there about cognitive training, what's offered, our cognitive, our group-based programs offered, other forms of post-diagnostic care offered. And in general, we find that in comparison to drug treatments, the non-pharmacological treatments are rarely provided. The other thing we're doing is training. So we've had a whole suite of webinars that typically run on a Thursday afternoon, various ones that particularly ADNeT participants and clinicians have asked for. So the next one is actually conducted by me on sleep disturbance and my colleague Simon Lewis. That's in August. But these are actually all available on YouTube, so people can access these as they need to. We also have asked a lot of questions about training needs from the ADNeT Memory Clinic Network, and we will be now developing a bit more of a tailored training program and peer support program for people and clinicians within memory clinics as well. There are some tools that we've been working on, so a tool for neuropsychologists so that they can spend less of their time doing assessments and writing reports and more time providing post-diagnostic care, we hope. So that's a neuropsychology norming tool, and also working with current ANSTI on a personalised dementia risk reduction tool. So just briefly, you can see here that this is something that's been greatly facilitated actually by CSIRO in terms of setting this up, but the neuropsychologist would just plug in the tests that they've been given and the patient details, and a report will come out that contains all of the data according to certain normative criteria that have been inputted. But there are some options to pick various norms according to the clinician's preference, and also to input data directly into the fields as well for more unusual tests. Then we've actually got a PhD student starting that will be developing or implementing some of this risk reduction information within a key select group of memory clinics as well. Really, what's the best way to deliver this? Does it actually result in any behaviour change in terms of risk reduction, and how do we facilitate that? As Chris said, the other key thing really is having access to the clinical trials network and trying to facilitate patients accessing various clinical trials, new diagnostics such as the blood-based biomarkers and the PET scans, which I think have been enabled greatly by the ADNeT network. How do we better provide post-diagnostic support? This, of course, can be done in some ways through research studies, but importantly, we're going to have to work together to lobby various state and federal health departments as well to provide funding where there are gaps in key areas where we think there are actually evidence-based interventions. And one of those that we'll be focusing on is actually cognitive intervention programs for MCI. We've done some work, our group's done some work at St Vincent's looking at implementing cognitive training in the memory clinic setting. We've done a whole health economics analysis around that, but of course there are other groups in Melbourne, such as the Latch program run by Karen Pike, etc. So we think this is something that's kind of ripe to take across the memory clinic network, and certainly there are opportunities for people to engage in that. And just to wrap up, I'd like to thank the Memory Clinic Network's team and our fabulous steering committee and the operations committee that's been doing so much of the work behind the scenes there too. Thanks, that was super quick. But a lot to say in a short amount of time.
Definitely. Thank you, Sharon, for sharing with us that wonderful work being done under the memory clinics for ADNeT. So with that, I will now invite all our speakers for suggestions and discussions on opportunities for collaborating with ADNeT. So please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A function. So Nadika will now commence with some very general questions, followed by questions raised by our attendees. So Nadika, over to you.
Great, thanks
for the Q&A session.
Thank you, and thanks so much for all three speakers, and that was really comprehensive, and I also got to know what ADNeT is about and the different sections of the ADNeT. So to kickstart, I'm just going to ask just a couple of sort of brief questions, just to get us get to know how we can be involved with ADNeT. So I'll just direct the questions to each of the speakers, starting with Stephanie. So because we are more sort of catering for people with early to mid-career researchers in this session in particularly, we're quite keen to know how an early career or a mid-career researcher can be involved and collaborate with ADNeT. And if you can give sort of an example, if each speaker can give us an example, that will be wonderful. So over to you, Stephanie, if you'd like to comment first. Thanks.
Thank you. So really, the registry, what we look to do is to recruit clinical sites that are involved in the diagnosis of dementia and mild cognitive impairment. So that's, and I imagine that that's not everybody on this call, but some people here, I would very much encourage to get involved, because if you are working in a diagnostic setting, we are still in the early stages. It's a really great opportunity to shape the type of data that we collect and how we run the registry, because we are really indebted to our early adopters who've helped us already make this better. But I think for early career researchers, it will really be a good resource for example, accessing eventually de-identified data that can be interrogated to explore a number of different hypotheses. Certainly the Swedish Dementia Registry is now amassed so many participants that it's become a very rich data source for investigation. There's been a number of publications, tens and tens of publications that have come from that, ranging from, and I know, Edwin, you've done some work with the Swedish Dementia Registry. You might be able to speak later about the types of things that you've looked at, but ranging from looking at disparities in health outcomes to, you know, a recent paper I looked at, which was longer term outcomes from use of cholinesterase inhibitors. We have a data access policy, and I think that people, when we think about accessing data from the registry, I think about it in two ways. One is accessing de-identified data that the registry has collected, and the other is utilising or connecting with participants on the registry who might be interested in being part of research studies. Now, because we're in a pilot phase at the moment, we're still working on a mechanism for the latter part. And in the first instance, we're going to bed down the processes to link our participants to screens and trials for those people that want to be part of that. And it's also really important that we protect the participants in the registry, because we have an opt-out process and we're aiming to get everybody on. Not everybody will want to be contacted for research studies. And we also need to make sure clinical sites are comfortable with their patients being contacted. So we are working on that aspect. But we do have a third-party data collection policy. We're not probably at the stage of sharing that data just yet, but we do hope that the data we collect will be useful for researchers to access, and hopefully also to help connect people who are running trials eventually to people who are on our registry who have indicated they'd be comfortable in being contacted.
Right, thank you. I think I actually had both questions in terms of the consent process, and as well as if research actually wants to recruit participants using your registry. It's amazing to see there's over 2,000 or so people volunteered within the registry.
Oh, no, not 2,000. I think that's the volunteer register for Chris, I think. So right. The clinical registry, it's only under 400 at the moment. Right.
So, so I guess the consent process for the clinical registry, it's sort of patients, people with dementia who actually attend the clinics, they consent for research. How does that sort of work?
And I think that's a really great question. So for participation in the registry, because it's a clinical quality registry, we are able to use an opt-out consent process, because the registry is primarily for collection of data to inform on the quality of care. And how that works at the clinical interface is that the clinician doesn't need to do the consent with the patient, but they do need to make a determination on whether the patient in front of them would have the capacity to understand a written document that will come about 2 weeks later, that will explain that the clinic collects data for the registry, what type of data is collected, and importantly, what to do if they're not comfortable with being part of the registry. So we ask clinicians to make a determination on the likely ability of someone to do that based on the history taking, you know, can this person still manage their own mail, understand written material, dial an unfamiliar number or email, or put something in a post, or ask somebody to do that if they felt they could do that. And if we have concerns that the person in front of us would not manage those aspects, then we ask if there's a person responsible. And for clinicians, a person responsible follows a similar hierarchy in most states. The number one on that is an appointed medical substitute decision maker. So in New South Wales, that's called an enduring guardian. In Victoria, that's called a medical power of attorney, etc. Or if there's a live-in carer, a spouse, and it goes down that list. And then the third question is everybody aware of the diagnosis? Because we don't want the registry sending out letters to people who have no idea what's going on, because that would just be unethical. It would be very inappropriate. And then that person can choose to opt out on behalf of the family member. But we also have an ethics approval in place to collect baseline clinical data from people who don't have capacity, and that may be the case for people with more of a moderate stage of cognitive impairment and don't have a person responsible, or who do have a person responsible that's not aware of the diagnosis. And we have that ethics approval in place because people who perhaps are presenting at more moderate stage of cognitive impairment, or who are more socially isolated, are actually at risk of worse outcomes. And it's important that their data is collected. So what about people who might want to be contacted for research studies? So we are in a pilot phase, and this is something that we're working out on, because it's not the same. It's not the same to say opt out that everyone gets, you know, contacted for research. It's a different ethical threshold to cross. What we have in our minimum data set is an option for clinician to indicate whether the patient would be interested in being contacted for future research studies. And at the moment, they can tick yes or no or not discussed. And in the first instance, we are just trying to clarify the best processes to link people who are interested with screens and trials as a pilot first, before we then embark upon linking this group of people to other research studies as well. Because it's very different. Everyone who comes into the clinic who gets a new diagnosis optimally should be on the registry.
Sure.
Not everyone would be wanting to be contacted. And we have to be really mindful of the sensitivities around that as well, about people being cold called for other research opportunities down the track, particularly given the nature of the condition of dementia and the stresses for families as well.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it's good to know where you're at and what stage, and yours at the moment it's pilot stage and it's not open for other researchers.
Not just yet, but that will change. And we've come a long way in the last year. We only started collecting data in February last year. So, we've come a fair way. We're making good gains, and we hope to have those processes sorted out within the next sort of 3 to 6 months. We'll be, we're probably moving beyond that pilot stage now. We're making some changes to our data collection form in response to how the first phase has gone.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Chris, just over to you, just asking, how do you think early to mid-career researchers can be involved in your part? And give us a sort of an example to enlighten us, please.
Well, the easiest way is to find research volunteers for your project, particularly cognitively normal, and you could specify whether you wanted people with subjective cognitive impairment with a family history or not, and of a particular age. And if we think your project's worthwhile, we can supply you with the contact details of those patients to then approach and ask them if they want to participate in your research studies. So they've obviously they've sought out the research volunteer portal themselves. They've signed the consent form. They've ticked the box that's in it saying, yes, I agree to be contacted about research projects. So we don't have to worry too much about consent when distributing that information to reputable researchers. The other big thing is people that are interested in getting blood samples from highly characterised individuals with basically proven pathology of Alzheimer's disease or not. So the blood's a bit of a scarce resource, but it is available if your project has merit and it's not cutting across what existing ADNeT researchers are already doing, then you could certainly make a strong case for getting access to some of the blood and the results of the diagnostics and cognitive testing that goes with that. And that's pretty damn useful, because basically, if you look at the costs of what we've got so far, if you had to do that from scratch, it would cost you at least $4 million to collect all the data we've got and are making available at this time.
I also had a question from the audience. Tim's asking, how are the blood samples stored within ADNeT?
They are certainly fractionated. There's serum, there's plasma, there's whole blood. Now, I'm not sure about peripheral. The question was to do particularly with the peripheral BMCs, mononuclear cells. I would have to get back to you on that one, whether they've been specifically spun to get those or not. But they certainly are fractionated into about 12 different fractions. So there's a chance that that was done.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Chris. Sharon, just over to you. If you can give us sort of an example of how early to mid-career researchers can be potentially involved in the memory clinics part and in researchers in general as well. Thanks.
Sure. I guess the more Memory Clinics initiative develops, the more I realise that we're working in the area of health services, which is a good thing because they're certainly lacking behind for dementia. So, you know, with that in mind, I guess I'd say that, you know, projects that are implementation science focused are probably the better ones. And of course, it's up to all the individual memory clinics how, you know, whether or not they may want to engage in certain projects, but they certainly may be able to assist in terms of helping to run focus groups and other things that are often part of the initial implementation science process. You know, there are some clinics that might be involved in implementation style trials. So we have one, you know, in sleep where memory clinics are involved. And, you know, they're important because we have to get that important cost effectiveness kind of data in order to be able to implement anything that we do in research into the actual memory clinic setting. So I think there's a lot of people, you know, within this network and beyond that are doing various lifestyle interventions, etc. And I think that memory clinics, in my experience to date, are very open to supporting projects where they see a clear benefit for their patients and where it's not too onerous. So not too much poking and prodding, but, you know, offering interventions and doing something that's, you know, potentially useful, even if it's for a shorter period of time, you know, is something that I've found memory clinics are generally happy to support. So, you know, and on the other kind of side of things, it's difficult sometimes, like even in the various grant rounds, people have contacted us and said, can memory clinics support their project? We can't really do that. We can, I guess, try to make introductions, but I guess, you know, bringing in multiple memory clinics helps us to build a network. And certainly anyone that's interested in post-diagnostic support might want to join some working groups and things that we're establishing for that as well. The other thing, I guess, you know, from a health services perspective is really getting more data. So the data around dementia is still pretty bad. And even the new data on timely diagnosis, you know, data on that we have is about 10 years old. So getting some new data on that is important. And we've started some conversations with the Department of Health and Australian Institute of Health and Wellbeing around that to kind of, you know, that's all important in terms of what do we need to do and where do we need to go next.
Absolutely. It's amazing how you developed this memory clinic network throughout Australia. That I think it's an amazing effort that you have put in. So I guess if a researcher wishes to sort of participate in terms of implementation research or even within intervention, post-diagnostic interventions, what's the point of contact?
Good question. So.
Yeah.
People could certainly contact me. We also have, I'll put it in the chat, we also have the General Memory Clinic's email that's actually based at UNSW and is, checked all the time. And the team there can certainly, together provide a response or, connect the researcher into the relevant person where possible. So I'll put that in the chat.
That'll be great. Thanks, Sharon.
Can I just make a comment? Of course, you can go to the Australian Dementia Network website and look up the contact details for the memory clinics in your area and contact them directly yourself. In my memory clinic, we often have people coming past to our multidisciplinary meeting, giving a pitch for their research, hoping that we'll refer patients to it, etc. So the more clinics you approach, probably your better chance of success, and you can use that to identify clinics in your area.
Sure, thanks. Thanks. Right, so I'm just going to take up some of the questions here. So one question, I think this is probably more relevant to Stephanie. Kylie's asking, are there any plans to enhance the diversity or inclusion of participants in the volunteer registry? Also, probably it's Chris's volunteer registry.
Yeah, I think it's for Chris, the volunteer registry,
yeah.
not the clinical quality registry.
And this is an important opportunity to more comprehensively address issues of diversity and disparities in dementia research in Australia. Chris, do you have any comments with regards to that?
Well, our priority has really been for clinical drug trials, and of course you've got to be able to speak English to do the cognitive testing, etc. So in the US there's a big push on, of course, for more inclusion of African Americans and Hispanics. We haven't gone that way yet. We're just pushing the majority of the population first. It's more of an issue in the USA, frankly, because the socio-demographics, comorbidities, etc., between African Americans and Caucasian Americans is probably greater than we'd see here, and they've got a much larger proportion of the population falling into those groups. So it's something we're thinking about. And we do have a bit of a plan to bring in some other institutes that are more aligned to those sort of projects.
Okay.
Oh.
I think Annie, our communications person from ADNeT, wants to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, Chris, that at this stage, because of everything you've said, it's really important that when we test people, we're testing the cognitive ability and not their English proficiency, which can get very messy if you are testing people with a standard English test who might have difficulty with English. So I think it's really important to keep that very clear, and until we have suitable tests and protocols, then we need to limit the participation to people who speak good English, which puts me out of contention.
Right.
I just wanted to say that we do, for the clinical quality registry, we collect country of birth, language spoken. I can't remember off the top of my head, but of the real people coming through clinics, it's about 40% born outside of Australia. At the moment, our patient-facing or our participant-facing documents are only in English. We will be working on translating the content of that into a number of different languages. And in fact, one of our clinical sites, or our potential clinical sites, has come to us and said, we won't be part of this until you've done this. It's not a simple translation, because when you translate nuanced health information, it actually needs to make sense. So it's not just a simple matter of translating that. In the registry, we do collect a brief score on cognitive screen, and we present 4 options. and you can complete all of those if you've done those in a clinical setting. So one is the MMSE, otherwise known as the International Language of Cognitive Test. It's used by everyone, but it's not that great. But we also collect the RUDAS score, which, as many of people will understand, is validated for use in non-English speaking populations. We collect a MOCA, and we also collect, if it's been completed, a KICA, the Kimberley, a cognitive instrument that's been developed for First Nations people who are living in remote communities. With the registry, we haven't yet done this, but we do wish to develop a working party to help with the use of the clinical quality registry in First Nations populations. And we do have a number of sites participating at the moment around Cairns under Eddie Struven's leadership, so that we want to ensure that the clinical quality registry is actually representing modern day Australia, which, as we know, is diverse. We are trying our best to capture clinical data from those groups.
Great, thank you very much. It's a pretty comprehensive answer. Thanks, Stephanie. So I just got another question from Marianne Coleman, asking about, is it feasible to disseminate research findings through ADNeT? I know there was ADNeT ADF that was run in terms of disseminating research findings, but I think this is more of a specific question. So if there are material that's developed as part of the research, and if it's potentially useful for maybe, for example, post-diagnosis, would that be would it be available for researchers to collaborate and disseminate that type of maybe knowledge transfer type material within any of the registry or the memory clinic? I think it's probably for Sharon for within the memory clinic.
Annie's source of dissemination, so I'll let Annie answer.
Sure, thanks, Annie.
She's in charge.
So Annie, you're on mute.
What a mistake for a communications person.
I know,
You're
know,
fired.
Chris. Do not give me a hard time. I was trying to say that the ADF is probably the key channel for sharing research amongst researchers who are active in the dementia arena. So that is a really important avenue. Now, that doesn't mean that it's the only one. And I guess that the best response I can provide now is that I would personally take a case-by-case approach. So if it is something that clearly has a very wide range interest, or could have a very wide range interest, I would consider communicating through our newsletter or even through our website. Well, some research who might be very narrow, sorry, that's my phone, who might have a more narrow focus might be better just providing contact to that researcher, saying maybe might be good for you to approach such a person. So ADF in the first hand and case-by-case basis otherwise.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just add, we do plan to add more useful tools to the Australian Dementia Network website. And I've been working for a while on a slide program for how to read amyloid and FDG PETs, but I haven't finished it yet. But once it's done, it'll be put up on the website for clinicians to access. And of course, this risk scale that's being developed, if that's come to maturity and you want to make it available to the public, then we'd love to make that available through the ADNeT website.
Yeah, there is a page on the website that says I am a researcher, and we are loading up tools and resources as they become available. So if the research, as I said before, is something that has wide-ranging implications, certainly it's a place where we could put it as a resource as well.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Alex asking, would ADNeT consider systematically collecting intervention-related outcome data from participating practices which patients take part in clinical interventions?
I might answer that. But actually, can I just clarify what you mean by intervention-related outcome data? Is that possible to clarify, Alex?
I'm guessing it's potentially if there are studies, the clinical trials run on interventions, and we collect a lot of outcome measures.
Because I think that's a really good question. Yeah. And I think that it is something that we would really love to see the registry assist with, is particularly if participating clinics are, for example, continuing to see their patients, and we can get follow-up clinical data from that group, as well as some follow-up patient and carer reported measures, and then longer term data with data linkage. I mean, we'd really love to see the data that's being collected by the registry, you know, be leveraged by other studies and initiatives to look at outcomes over time, real world outcomes.
Right.
So I'd like to say that that type of idea is something that the registry is very supportive of, and I think we've already. Oh, Alex, you're asking about that systematic collection. I mean, I guess that is something that we hope that the registry would be able to help, and we've supported a number of, you know, possible research studies or grants that have gone in with the idea that outcome measures will in part be collected through the registry.
Okay, that's great. I think there's another question.
Sorry, could I just add? I've only just seen the Q&A, Alex's question. We are going to set up an accreditation process where the clinics actually will audit their practice as well. So initially it'll be a self-audit. So we'll be able to, at the level of the memory clinics, I guess, get a better understanding of what kind of cognitive rehab work's being done, Alex, but not necessarily have the individual patient level kind of data. But you're going to be part of our working group, Alex, I believe. So you'll help us with this.
Great, thank you. I think it's a sort of a follow-up question from Marianne, who asked earlier, are there any plans to log usage of allied health services and multidisciplinary enablement interventions, including case management within ADNeT? So is it just limited to memory clinics? Anybody? Chris, do you have any thoughts on that? Are there any plans to sort of expand to other allied health services?
Sorry, I was reading the questions and I didn't listen.
No, sorry.
Can you tell me the question again?
So are there any plans to log usage of allied health services and multidisciplinary enablement interventions, including case management within ADNeT?
I think that's part of memory clinics, really, multidisciplinary meetings and post-care planning and so forth.
That will also be part of the audit and accreditation once the guidelines are put out. So we're developing the accreditation audit process at the moment. So we will be able to ascertain which clinics offer things like reablement, other post-diagnostic support, which I had a few of them listed there, but happy to share my slides. I guess at the individual level, the clinical quality registry will be able to determine who accesses allied health services. I'm assuming, Stephanie, at some point, but certainly within memory.
Yeah. Potentially through linked data, we can get some aggregate idea of different health service use. In terms of clinical data follow-up for the registry, potentially, but we also just need to be mindful of the burden of data entry and who's the best to put that in. Certainly we've looked at, and with our current work with Registry of Older South Australians, we are looking at some measures of health service use. When it comes to quality, I guess we just want to be really clear that outcomes are possibly, the most important, but we can also measure, health service use in the interim.
Okay, thanks. Another question from Alex is there a formal process in place to access potential volunteers for relevant student research projects? Is it possible at this stage, or is it more of a future goal? Chris, are you able to answer? Sorry.
No, certainly you can start asking for volunteers accessing the volunteers now. In Melbourne anyway, we've got over 2,000 of them. That's more than we need for any projects we've got planned at the moment. So as I mentioned, go to the Australian Dementia Network.org.au website, get the expression of interest form, fill it in and submit it, and it'll be discussed at the next ADNeT Management Committee meeting. They're held on the first Friday of every month. And if it looks like a sensible project and worth supporting, then yes, you'll get access.
Great, thank you. I think it sort of follows up with whether there are any fees to access data and to collaborate, to access volunteers or access de-identified data, etc. How does that sort of work? Is it under sort of a research collaborative agreement, or are there any costs involved for researchers, especially if it's for ECRs or MCRs?
Yeah, so your ability to pay is taken into account. So if you're loaded with money, then you're expected to pay for access to some of the stuff. And certainly when commercial companies come to us, we charge them a lot. For academics who have a grant, then if there's something built into that grant that covers some of what we're supplying, then we'd expect some of that. If you don't have a grant, then you can still access certain data, but it may be just sort of pilot type numbers rather than full study numbers at that stage.
Thank you. I think that sort of brings into my next question. I think probably the last question before we finish. How can researchers sort of be involved in terms of if they're writing a grant, say, what are their opportunities and options to be involved with and do a grant in collaboration with ADNeT? Are there any examples you can maybe share or give us sort of some insights into that?
It has to be diversity on major grant applications. So that really does increase opportunities for certain demographics to be chief investigators and associate investigators on major grant applications and other areas of diversity. So there is a real positive influence there. And grants do have to have also their chance of success is improved if you've got a range of researchers from early, mid and late career. So there are now opportunities for mid-career researchers in particular to join large teams of experienced researchers in major grant applications. So the opportunity is there. You just you do need to talk to the people in your area, in your region that already have affiliations with ADNeT and have a bit of track record and try and become part of the team.
Can I just add to that, Chris? It's important people plan those early. We're all guilty, I guess, of doing grants at the last minute, but I think it's difficult. Like if these come to the management committee, there needs to be time for people to discuss it and give feedback and ask questions and those kinds of things.
Further to that, again, on the website, there is a list of all ADNeT investigators. So easy for all of you to find who works in your selected area or in your state or your city. And that would probably be the first point of call or approach for future collaboration.
I wanted to add to say, yes, I think we're formalising a process now, aren't we, with respect to the management committee, so that I think in the past when MRFF and CREs were coming, there were ideas to leverage off what we're building with the ADNeT initiative. I'll speak on behalf of the registry again to say we're trying to build something that's useful for a lot of people. We're useful for the clinicians, useful for patients, but useful for researchers, particularly health service researchers, but people were. We're building this and we want it to be helpful. So we'd certainly welcome people reaching out to say, we've got this idea, we want to evaluate something. Is this something that we can leverage off what the registry is doing to collect outcomes? And, within the registry team, we'd, have a chat to say, well, is this something we think we can work out, and we take that to the steering committee, we take that to the management committee of ADNeT to make sure that's all right. And within our group, you know, we'd work out, you know, who would be best to sort of, you know, fly the flag for the registry. But we do want this to be helpful, and something that, you know, can help others, and, you know, belong to everybody that's contributing. So don't feel shy to reach out with what we're doing with the registry. We've got a few papers that now describe what we're collecting and what we're doing, and we're happy to sort of share, you know, the types of data we're collecting, if that's going to be helpful. But in the past, I've had a number of people want to sort of write the registry into a proposal in a way of evaluating something. So go for it.
Great, good to know. Thank you. Chris, did you have anything more to add at this stage?
Oh, I think I've said enough.
Okay, great. We've got a couple of minutes left, so I'll just open up to our other panel members who are actually members of the accelerator group. We've got Edwin, Michelle, and Tuan. Just sorry on the spot. I'm just checking whether you have any questions. And if you do, just turn on your video camera and ask your questions, if that's okay. And I can see quite a few chat messages going on. So while I just check that out, do you all have any questions if you want to turn your camera on and ask? Michelle, did you have a question to bring up?
Yeah, I just mentioned something in the chat, and Sharon answered that. I was just interested in the personalised dementia risk reduction tool, just with the kind of idea of trying to encourage people to volunteer for the volunteer registry. In our institute, we did a similar thing with skin cancer, where it was kind of used as like a public engagement tool, where people could put in their information about their sun exposure and things, and then it said what your risk of skin cancer is and what you could do to decrease your risk. So just kind of thinking that could be some, maybe, and it was all part of a big media campaign, and that could be something that could be done for dementia, possibly as part of a media campaign, and then that could encourage people then at the end say, would you like to sign up to our registry?
I think that's a good idea. Just a couple of things. So the one that we'll be implementing in the memory clinics is will be slightly tweaked from Karen's ADRI risk tool to be for secondary prevention, because people with MCI who will be kind of tailored towards really have indicated risk. So their risk is actually different. And one problem we have in dementia, unlike, heart disease, for example, is with heart disease, you can say, if you reduce your blood pressure by this much, you'll reduce your risk of an event by 10% within 3 years. And we don't have that kind of data for dementia. But many of you would know Karen's tool, the ADRI, tool has been used and has been on her website, and the one she had at ANU for many years. So that's certainly something that we can speak further with Chris about if it's useful to put on the volunteer portal. But I think with some of those other caveats around it, we don't know ApoE for allele, these are people that in the community, they're not necessarily people that are complaining of having memory problems, etc. And that, we can only really say that your overall risk is this, but we don't have enough information about targeting blood pressure, for example, how much that would reduce the individual's risk by. But good idea, I think so.
Good, thank you. Edwin, do you have any questions?
Thanks everyone for the great presentations. Stephanie, I had a question about the registry. You mentioned that there would be follow-ups with patients. I was wondering, is that sort of like an annual follow-up, and what sort of information would you be collecting in those follow-ups?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Edwin. So first of all, it's not going to be something that we can collect at all of our sites, because particularly in Melbourne, for example, the memory clinic network, the CADMS network, generally do a diagnosis of, for example, dementia, and then after a period of time, that person is discharged. But in the clinic I work in a number of clinics around Australia, people do tend to follow their patients up. So we're working at the moment on very, very topical. We are finalising a clinical data set that we would collect annually. In a large part, it will replicate aspects of the baseline data collection form. And I didn't really go into what type of data we collect, but what we do is ask things like, what's the diagnosis? If it's dementia, what's the subtype? If it's MCI, is it amnestic or non-amnestic? We're not quite doing preclinical prodromal AD yet, but this will change when we've got biomarkers and better diagnostic opportunities. We collect baseline cognitive scores. We collect some very baseline gross summary measures around function of the patient, so independence in personal and instrumental activities of daily living, driving, some aspects of medical history, and whether certain medications are prescribed. And I'm just suggesting that we revise some of that and enhance the data that we're collecting as well. One of the great things about our clinical sites is that quite a few of our clinical sites, Chris, as yours, has done this as well, so we want to collect extra information. We've been taking that on board. So we're collecting perhaps some more detail about risk factors and a bit more information about any neuropsychiatric burden. And so at the annual thing, what would be annual data collection, what we'd be interested in is change in diagnosis. And we'd also be interested in cognitive score, BPSD, behavioural and psychological symptoms of dementia function, and then use of some dementia medications to date. So whether cholinesterase inhibitor was trialled and stopped or never trialled, current or ongoing use of antipsychotic, antidepressant. You're interested in, when we haven't finalised yet, I'd love to send it.
Yeah.
I know that Sweden do some annual follow-up, and I'm aware that they ask a question about whether the patient or the family member thinks the person has declined, and they also ask if diagnosis has changed. Clinical follow-up data is really the backbone of a clinical quality registry, because that's where you get to see how people are progressing over time. In Australia, it is tricky because there's not a clear pathway in which people are annually assessed. Often care is handed back to general practitioners, and it can be a little bit non-systematic in that way, which is not what you want with the registry. But where we can do it, we will do it.
Sounds good. Thanks, Stephanie.
Great, thank you so much. For the interest of time, I'm just going to hand over to Tejal to give the closing remarks of the webinar. And I'd like to thank again all the speakers today, and also Annie as well for her input into the panel discussion, and our accelerator group members as well. So thank you very much, and just over to Tej to do the closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadika. It's been a wonderful session, and it's been a pleasure being with all of you. And thank you very much to all our speakers and the attendees for your time today. I guess the first step for us is to fill out that expression of interest form and send it over to Chris for assessing. And I look forward to more important and impactful key collaborations as part of this webinar in the future. Thanks everybody for your time.
Thank you.